Well, good morning, folks. How's Vegas treating you? Had a good show till now? My name is Vineet Tyagi. I'll be talking about in the next 30 minutes about the topic I'd like to present a blueprint for a data warehouse modernization. We only have 30 minutes, so there's a lot of details that I could present, but you're welcome to stop by our booth, 233, or catch me later outside. I'll be happy to answer more detail level questions, but basically this is how we'll spend our 30 minutes today. I would want to talk about a little bit about what are the drivers for data warehouse modernization. What are some of the things that force you to think about modernizing your data warehouse. Obviously, we all know big data is real, big data is available, and we all want to utilize that in our warehouse. But what are some of the real things that force us to kind of think in that direction? I'll talk about a little bit in aspect of the dimensions of data warehouse modernization. So we have been working with big data since 2008, even before the term became a very big buzzword. And in our experience, working with a lot of customers, we've seen that there's certain dimensions, that we could extract from the work that we've done. I'd like to share those, and then move on and present a data lake, enterprise data warehouse, or a logical data warehouse, whatever you like to call it. Take your pick. And how does one use this architecture to data warehouse modernization? So I'll present a kind of a staged approach and a blueprint for modernizing our data warehouses. So in terms of the drivers, some of the things that we have been seeing, and I'm sure that all of you would be experiencing, is the fact that obviously one of the largest thing is handling the big data, large volumes and the 3 V's of data, both on the volume, variety, and the velocity side of the data. The other driver that we've seen is that a lot of the enterprises and the warehouses have become siloed, and there is a push to integrate all of these warehouses together, which are done for multiple purposes or purpose-built data marts, and create a kind of a single source of truth. So irrespective of big data, there is also the driver for integration that's forcing us to look at modernizing our data warehouses. The cost reduction is one of the biggest drivers. As you start the integration or handling the big data with the current set of technologies and the tools that we have for building our data warehouses, if you scale that out, that in terms of handling these increasing volumes and variety and velocity of data is going to be a costly proposition. So how do you reduce your cost and contain the cost, not only on the handling the data storage perspective, but also the perspectives of how do you process the data, how do you actually ETL the data, the analytical processes that you're running on the data, and any other processing needs that you may have with the data per se. Increasingly, we are seeing that we are moving away from a statistical paradigm of sampling to working with more empirical ways of working with data, like applying science with it. So what this means is basically, in terms of advanced analytics, there is a big driver that's forcing us to look at not just sampling data and applying our statistical techniques on it, but working with all the data and trying to find meaningful insights from all the data that we possess. So that's another big driver that's happening. And the last one, but not the least, is the time reduction. Gone are the days where your business users are not going to be happy getting an answer that it's going to take us 6 weeks to get this data churned out and integrated and available for insights. So that's another big push for drivers that we're seeing. In terms of some of the dimensions of the modernized data warehouse, so there is the dimension of the nature of data. While you can use Hadoop-oriented data lakes and other things for even storing structured data, but this dimension talks about what is your ratio, how much unstructured data are you dealing with versus the structured data that you use for insights. And typically unstructured data, how much of raw data you want to use, how are you going to accumulate that, what rate are you going to accumulate that on. So the nature of data and the ratio of these two things that are available, that's also one dimension that we look at and analyze the need for modernizing a data warehouse. The second dimension, a very important one, is what is the level of unification of data that you're looking for? And that necessarily talks about, the things that, are you just looking at using unstructured data to drive and enrich the insights for your existing data? Or are you looking at integrating these two data sets together to derive new types of, insights that were not possible earlier? So it's a fine line. Are you going to use the unstructured or the newly acquired data sources to just get some insights out of that and then mix it with your existing data and then create new insights? Are you going to mix both the data together to drive the new insights? And typically the use cases that become available because of this is the time analysis kind of use cases that you want to do, and also delta data detection. You want to see how your business data has changed over a period of time. It also encourages experimentation. So what is the culture that you want to build? From a compliance perspective, many companies are not very open to encourage a lot of experimentation on data. So what is your comfort level on opening up the data and the access to the whole source of the data? Are you open to create the lines of businesses creating their own business solutions or not? So that's another dimension on which the analysis has to be done. Like I talked about, that moving from a statistical analyst intuition driven paradigm to a more empirical paradigm, which forces us to actually look at the whole data and the insights that come from the data rather than just relying on our experience. The business analyst thought so from the sample of the data that he saw. And obviously the scale being driven by demand. You should be able to scale based on the demand. Moving on, I'll very quickly talk about, you all probably would know what a data lake is, but my definition is it's a very massive and easily accessible data repository which is flexible and scalable as well. That's primarily built on inexpensive computer hardware. So it doesn't really require very sophisticated or high-end computational servers to be available. And the important perspective that defines the data lake for us is that it is designed to store uncategorized information in its raw format, as is format, which might include all the data that is immediately of interest to us or might be potentially of interest to us. And here's the killer one, that it even stores the data that we don't know what use it might be. So a data lake has to be scalable and kind of a cheap repository, because you're just putting everything that you can acquire there and making sure that it is accessible to you when you need it. So we see the modernization perspective not because we were at a Gartner conference and big data is a big buzzword these days and we got to have the big data, but modernization because the big data technologies are driving certain new capabilities which did not exist earlier, that we would be missing out if we did not modernize our databases. So these top four that in our experience, active archive. So this is the biggest one. So a data lake driven modernization would allow us to have a very active archive of information which can be accessed on demand for compliance perspectives, for analyst perspectives, for experimentation or exploratory analysis perspective. So that this is the biggest one capability that a data lake can bring to the modernized data warehouse. Then also self-service exploratory BI can become possible with a data lake capability. Now, this again is a very important one because now you have the access to the whole source of truth, these new forms of data, and you could be moving your existing data as well and mixing this and providing a sandbox, a safe kind of a behind the firewalls exploratory zone for your analytical users to actually look at the data and figure out what might be use cases or what might be the areas where, the enterprise could leverage new models or, could leverage new insights from the data which is there. It does include another capability. I've already spoken about it, advanced analytics at scale, meaning that instead of a sample set of data, we're working in the full sets of data. There's a lower cost of transformation as well. We have built this on cheap hardware. It's based on open source. SQL-like paradigms are available. So there's a typically lower cost of transformation for the data that we are handling at scale. Some of the typical benefits that we've seen, and this is the biggest modernization benefit, the top 3 in our case would be, kind of allowing the organization to create an adjunct or an augmented to your enterprise data warehouse. We like to call it, that instead of a data warehouse DWBI stack that you had, now you kind of converting that into a data warehouse capabilities that you have, right? And with these augmented capabilities, and we saw that the top 4 capabilities are lower cost of transformation, advanced analytics, active archive, and certain other things. There are a variety of use cases that become, applicable. You could offload relatively colder data and workloads from your existing data warehouse so that you can free up the capacity, contain the cost, and then use the existing data warehouse for doing something more. We've worked with several customers where we've found that 40% of their existing data warehouse capacity is actually dedicated and going to ETL kind of workloads. And data warehouses are not meant to be used for in-database ETLs, right? So it could free up a lot of cost and move that kind of a colder data set and also the workloads onto the data lake in a Hadoop modernized, augmented big data warehouse. Obviously, you get tremendous support for unstructured data because in the Hadoop warehouse, you could be just putting in raw data. It's all schema on read, so you don't have to invest in pre-processing the data and finding out what the data structure might be. You could deal with cleansing the data quality later, and you can first ingest and land the data. It kind of also creates a new analytical paradigm that we are increasingly seeing, that it kind of democratizes the access to data. And what I mean when I say democratize, it's like everybody kind of gets the equal right or equal access to the data. Please raise your hands if you ever had trouble reaching out to a data set that was in some other department or was in some data mart that was not controlled by your line of business. All right, so there you go. So that's another capability that a data lake kind of a modernized architecture brings to to the fore. So obviously, this democratized access has certain drawbacks and needs a new form of governance to be put in place, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as to a blueprint of how you're going to manage that. The most important perspective that we've seen with a lot more enhanced or kind of evolved modernized database data warehouse is that you have the ability to do a cost performance analysis for the workloads that you want to put on your warehouse. Now what this means is that let's say that there's a X number of data sources and a certain dimension and cardinality data set that you have to put, and you are moving certain processing and analytical workloads onto that particular use case. With the modernized data warehouse, with the data lake architecture, you now have 2 very important capabilities, and you can figure out on a cost performance basis what is the best place and the right cost performance that you want, and based on that you can decide, I want to run it on the data lake, the Hadoop driven warehouse, or do I want to use my existing DWBI infrastructure to run these workloads. If you don't modernize your warehouses, you're stuck with only having what you have, right? You don't have that power of the choice. So this is the biggest data lake architecture benefit that we're seeing that the organizations that we work with gain when they have a modernized warehouse. So let's move forward, kind of midway through, and I want to look at and talk a little bit about how do we really go about implementing a modernized data warehouse. And there are many strategies for that, and by far the biggest one is the, I would say I haven't seen any other, but this is the one of the most talked about as well, and in our experience the most implemented that we worked with our customers, is that use the data lake, start building capabilities, and then start integrating it with your existing enterprise data warehouse such that you have the logical data warehouse model in operation, right? And some of the design principles that we work with necessarily that, when you start designing and re-architecting the warehouse. So it's not a big bang approach, it's an evolutionary approach for us. I'll present that 4-stage approaches that we've successfully used. So obviously, the top 5 for us is discovery without limitations, low latency at any scale, got to have elasticity in the infrastructure so that you can scale with the demand rapidly. If it's going to take you another 6 weeks to add new nodes and provision for new data, you're back to the same world. And it has to be affordable, at scale, at almost unlimited scale. And you have to make sure that the architecture is rapidly moving the organization from a reactive paradigm of analytical processing to a predictive paradigm of analytical processing, meaning that you are driving the latency from the time you get the data to the time you can get insight out of that data, closer and closer and closer, such that it could be instantaneous. The moment you acquire the data, you can drive the insight from it. The important couple of challenges, and I would say kind of a checklist that we have from our experiences. Obviously, I did talk about the data lake that you can store all forms of data, but you cannot store all data, and you cannot ever even think about or plan for storing all the data. A good example is social data, right? You acquire social data on your customer, anonymized data sets. Do you store all of the Twitter firehose feed that you get? No, I don't think you should plan for storing all such kind of data. Get some cleansed insights or a cleansed data set that you think is important, and you only provision and plan to store that level of data in your in the data lake. The other one is the big one. I'm just looking at some of the things here. So let me talk about building our data lake. So in our experience, we've seen a staged approach to a data lake or modernizing your data warehouse, the most appropriate way to move forward. So we start from stage 1, which is where we try to set the foundation of handling and ingesting data at scale. Stage 2 is all about building the analytical muscle, having the ability to lay out the pipelines, monitor it, provision it, have all the operational aspects of it ironed out that you can handle it in production, and have some POCs and in production, as well as certain workloads shifted that are now forming an adjunct to the warehouse. Stage 3 is when you really start causing the operational impact. A large variety of your operational data stores, your data marts, and the workloads have started working in either using the insights being driven from the data lake or are working in unison with the data lake together. And lastly, then you have the enterprise capability where all enterprise data warehouses and marts, including the big data-driven data mart or the warehouse, appears and is available to the full organization as one big, giant capability. So let's look at stage 1 and some of the challenges and what we end up doing there. So the stage 1 looks fairly simplistic. If I have to, like the picture says 1,000 words here, you're creating a landing and an ingestion zone, basically. right? And then you're creating capabilities and ways to handle streaming sources of data, unstructured sources of data, bringing structured sources of data. They could be from third parties, or they could be coming from your own enterprise data marts or warehouses. So it might be a feedback kind of a loop control as well. Machine-generated data as well as external social sources of data. Now, why this is important is because this is what forms and proves for you what are the data sources, what kind of data sets are you going to be handling. We've seen in our experience that if we invest enough time, although it might sound counterintuitive that I'm not using the data right now, so why should I even spend time in building this capability? Maybe I just move on in parallel with figuring out all the workloads and everything. But we've seen that if we spend, at least the first part of the 3 months of your journey, I would say 8 to 12 weeks of your journey, proving out and perfecting this foundation, it lays a very good, it gives you the muscle to start experimenting very rapidly and set you up for success. 80% or more of the types of data that you would have to handle and the kind of kinks that are there in data and the problems of how am I going to acquire it, all that pipeline would be laid out by this 3-month phase. So talk about the stage 2. We're building the analytical muscle here. So we're now started leveraging the enterprise data in the data lake that's there on Hadoop, and we are now started experimenting all sorts of analytical workloads, batch, mini batch, real-time, interactive, exploratory, all types of latency, permutation combinations with the consumption-driven patterns. So this phase is also very important because we are now laying out the IT operations blueprint for the organization. So the foundation of how you provision, what workflows are there to handle these, how do you deploy in production, how do you deploy your application, your workloads, monitoring and your security policies and principles for data access are also, this would be the next part where we would be doing and laying out as well. That's when we start connecting this also with the kind of proof of value, proof of concept, building the use cases, integrating it with running applications to drive richer insights, kind of a phase. Some of the typical challenges that we've seen here is people do not look at the real-time nature of data. And they look at it fairly late in the game. So it's an after effect, an afterthought. And they say, okay, I'm not real-time enough and my business is not real-time enough. So I'll deal with it when it happens. Trust me, all businesses are real-time. And you would need it sooner than you can think because a lot of the value of the business can be rapidly gained from the real-time streaming sources of data. Now, with several of our customers we've also worked with, and we've shown them how real-time doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have the Twitter fire hose kind of real-time streams of data. But it could also mean that you could connect the data that flows within the enterprise, like in a fast enterprise bus. And that could be a stream that you could visualize. So you could connect, and your CRM system could be emitting the things that are happening in the operational data store as a stream of events. You could be looking at your HR system, you could be looking at your order taking system, and you could create a parallel stream of events that could be applicable and made available. So this foundational muscle is very important to integrate the applications for future. So it doesn't necessarily mean external sources of real-time streaming sources of data coming in. It also means that you are building the muscle to move the enterprise data around fast. So let's move on to the next phase, and that's the stage 3. The data lake and the EDW are now working in unison, and we are trying to look at the use cases where both could coexist. And these two are seen as two different sources of data that can be leveraged for each other's strength and other things. So typically, it just means that you start laying the pipes and the connections, data pipelines that take the data from the data lake into your warehouses and bring it back. Those are the kind of points, data points, exchange point pipelines that you would be setting up. And again, like I said, that we are coming out with this new thought process using the streaming platform that we built to kind of convert that into and leverage that to create a real-time streaming bus to move data fast within the enterprise. So that also could be used to move the data between the lake and the operational data warehouses as it happens. Now, so stage 4. So moving from stage 3 to stage 4 is when we run into the dilemma, right? That's what we like to call it. So the dilemma stands for the data and basically the ingestion and storage aspects of governance and security and compliance. So when you start looking at the data lake as your, in unison, and this is one big enterprise capability, there is a higher order of I would say, higher order of governance that is needed. There is a higher order of audit and compliance that is needed for this to operate at the whole enterprise level. Then the information lifecycle management. How do you manage the lineage of the data that flows between two distinct capabilities? How do you manage the lineage of the data that can coexist or partially can exist in the big data lake and in the data warehouse as well? The enterprise metadata management. You need to have a metadata layer that can help you discover what data lives where, what is available, how you can reach it, the discovery part, ontology, to describe the data as well, and the access. You need to have one unified way of accessing the data irrespective of where it resides. So if you solve the dilemma, then you move forward and you've got yourself a fully modernized data warehouse, which includes the data lake as an adjunct capability. Now you see that the only difference that you might notice here is another foundational layer of governance, information lifecycle management, etc. But this is a very important set of capabilities built on that. Now we don't have time to, I just had 30 minutes, but there's a lot more I can talk about how we actually went about doing governance, setting up the governance policies, a whole body of experience behind the ISO 27001, kind of experiences, HIPAA compliance, and all of those. There are enough number of things I can share with you, but we don't have the time to go into that level of detail today. So moving forward, this is what our blueprint has been, a 4-stage journey to reach there. And then the top 3 tactics that we are seeing, how once you have the the stage journey in motion, how people are using. Some of our customers are using it just the capabilities. At stage 1, once you get the stage 1 capability, it's not that you don't derive value out of it. At that point in time, you could start deriving value to make it a pre-processing engine, So you could write map-reduce jobs or use the landing zone to create capability to extract insights which could enrich your data warehouses. Then as you move on into the stage 2, you could be using it as an offloading kind of a tactic. You could offload colder workloads, colder sets of data, less risky sets of data onto the modernized warehouse. And then in a fully modernized warehouse, obviously the exploration kind of a use case is the biggest one. So once you have that capability, you could discover, explore new high-value insights from the data itself. So in summary, I'm not going to read all of this out, but Hadoop is real, big data is real. They are changing the face of the data warehouses forever. They're not going to replace the data warehouse architectures. TWBI technologies that exist are proven, have a place, and will continue to have a place. But the big data technologies are accelerating the possibilities for exploring new kind of opportunities that come with newer sorts of data. The modernization will necessarily entail that you re-architect the data warehouse. And this is an evolving journey, a staged journey. We're not suggesting a big bang approach. to add new capabilities. Like I said, one of the biggest things that we tell our customers in our experience has been modernize the way the data is shuffled around. If you do that later than earlier, it's going to come and bite you in the back very soon. And we've had customers that we worked with that we are helping them now to modernize the way the data is being shuffled around. There are models and approaches to handle the dilemma, and we have perfected some of those. So we'd love to talk to you about that. Stop by our booth. I'll be happy to talk more about that. And there are defined best practices and roadmaps for modernizing the enterprise data warehouse. I shared kind of a blueprint, but there's a lot more detail, and perhaps we keep on doing a series of webinars that we're planning to take each one of these elements and examine them in more detail and share our best practices. So please sign up. We are at impetus.com or write to us at bigdata@impetus.com, and we'll be happy to share more details with you. So I see I have a red light blinking and about a minute left, but I'll be happy to take more questions or if anybody has anything to share. Yes?
You have the unstructured data in the lake, but when you're trying to combine them in the logical, how do you get the more canonical views that average business users or analysts will want to look at the combined?
That's a Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's one of the biggest challenges that people have is like, you have two sources of data. How do I mix them? How do I understand what is there? And that's where, one of the things I talked about was the discovery, the metadata layer, and having that ability to discover the data and then figure out that, for average business users, how can they reach that data and, having the capabilities and the tools to extract and, work with that data. So there are many federation kind of tools which are there which federate data. There are data virtualization tools that allow that to happen. There's a new category of tools which are coming up with managed metadata in a more logical data warehouse fashion as well. So that's the biggest strategy. What we've seen is that people will have to start adopting this tool, and this kind of capability will have to be built in if you want to fully go to the stage 4. Right, any other questions? I'm out of time. If you have to, please do stop by our booth and we'll be happy to talk to you. Thank you for your time today.